Thank you, Madam President. I think that many of my colleagues feel very at home with this image, which is a reminder of a household name, Ramona, and her father, a great story written by Beverly Cleary. In fact, a prize-winning story, part of a series written, this particular story, in 1968. In 1968, and in this story, Ramona's dad is struggling with Dorothy, his name is Robert, to get by and keep the family together on a minimum wage job, which in 1968 paid $1.60 an hour. Today, the minimum wage, if it had kept pace with inflation, would be $10.71 an hour. We know, many of us, and probably many of my colleagues who have read this story, that Robert and Dorothy Quimby are engaged in a quiet struggle to make ends meet, even as Ramona is engaged in all kinds of antics and play. He is working as a grocery bagger at a local store. Ramona's mother is working too, an early example of a two-family household and two-income family. And they're able to keep their family afloat on that minimum wage in 1968, $1.60 an hour in 1968. For millions of Americans who read Ramona's story today, the idea of minimum wage enabling a family to stay afloat, keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, is a storybook fiction. Very difficult today to believe that Robert Quimby, as a bagger in a grocery store, could enable his daughters, Ramona and her sister, to have the life they did then. And in fact, it would be impossible because today, the minimum wage has failed to keep pace with inflation. The minimum wage today is $7.25, nowhere near what it would need to be, in fact, to keep pace with that rise of the cost of living. That's why we're here today, to raise the minimum wage to $10.10, still below the $10.71 that it would have been for Robert Quimby making the minimum wage in a grocery store if it had kept pace with inflation. And in fact, it is well below what's necessary to enable families to continue a normal life. That's why they are living in poverty, working men and women living in poverty despite being paid the minimum wage. That is a travesty and a mockery. It is a moral outrage. It is bad for our economy. It's bad for our families. It's bad for the fabric of our society. It's bad for America. And I'm proud to support an increase in the minimum wage. I'm proud that Connecticut has decided that it will raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, still below that $10.71 that is needed to get by today. We know the impact on families. We know the impact on children. We see them in our schools. Millions of children, 14 million children in families that are paid less than a minimum wage. We know the impact on our veterans. 500,000 or more paid less than the minimum wage. That is itself an outrage. Men and women who have served and sacrificed for our country come back to civilian life to be paid less than what they need to stay out of poverty, working and working hard. but still making less than minimum wage. Veterans who have served our country, who have put their lives on the line and have put themselves at risk, coming back to a society that rewards them with less than what they need to survive. I've talked to a lot of business people, and some of them are apprehensive, no question about it, but a lot of them say our workers are more productive because we pay well above the minimum wage, and many who will be impacted by this law, if it's passed, say that it's the right thing to do, and they support it. I'm talking about, for example, Max Kothari. For 25 years, he, along with his wife, Parul, have owned and operated Star Hardware in Hartford, one of the oldest hardware stores in the state of Connecticut. He supports this measure to raise the minimum wage to $10.10. And so does Doug Wade, who operates one of the oldest dairy companies in the state. Started by Doug's great-grandfather in 1893, Wade's Dairy in Bridgeport. He supports raising the minimum wage. 1,000 business people have signed a statement and petition.
Just get a water. I think they're going to get it.
We mentioned it this morning, that supports raising the minimum wage. And what they say is it's a fairness issue. It's simply a way to give folks a fair shot at the American dream, a fair shot at a quality of life that's good for their families and children, good for our society. And by the way, it's also good for our economy. $35 billion would be added to consumer demand because folks who make the minimum wage, if it's raised to $10.10, are not going to put the difference under their mattresses. They're going to spend it. They're going to buy more food and clothing and gas for their cars. They're going to buy things that drive the economy. They're going to purchase stuff that creates demand and more jobs and business for Max Kothari at his hardware store and for Doug Wade at his dairy. This kind of reasoning is not advanced economic theory. It's basic common sense. Americans understand it. That's why Americans support raising the minimum wage as a matter of fairness and enlightened self-interest economically. It's the right thing to do. And the arguments made against it are without basis, rationally and economically. The ones who suffer from the minimum wage as it exists right now are not teenagers. I know there's a myth that they are part-time workers or teenagers. Just not true. 90% of minimum wage workers are adults. They're disproportionately women and people of color and workers with disabilities, and they'll be helped disproportionately by raising the minimum wage, but they are not teenagers or part-time workers. And they are deserving, for the hard work that they do, of fair pay and a fair shot. That's all the minimum wage would really do, is give them a fair shot at economic opportunity. And those veterans, they deserve more than a fair shot. They deserve a hand up, not a handout. There's nothing about the minimum wage that is an entitlement. It's simply fair pay and a fair shot. We've trapped 500,000 of those veterans in poverty. 3,800 veterans in Connecticut alone will benefit from the $10.10 minimum wage. But we should guarantee this great land, the greatest in the history of the world, that people like Robert Quimby, Ramona's dad, and Dorothy Quimby and her sister are being paid at least what they were getting back in 1968 in today's dollars. That's the way to keep families together. That's the way to keep faith with the dream that all Americans have, that they will have a fair shot. No one who works full-time should live in poverty. No one who works should be so poor that they can't put food on the table or provide clothes to their children or give them the erasers that Robert Quimby did his daughters, pink erasers, as a gift. To enable 14 million children in America to have a better life, let's pass this measure. And let's make sure that if it fails this week, and it shouldn't, but if it does, we bring it back. And we continue to bring it back as long as necessary to assure a fair shot for all Americans who work hard and play by the rules. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.